Smoke from the wood stove mixed with the metallic reek of fresh blood. Aurelia pressed her spine against the rough-hewn logs, her 6'2" frame trembling for the first time since leaving Boston. Opposite her, the mountain man didn't blink. He just held the steaming, foul-smelling poultice and a bone-handled knife, his knuckles stained with grease and pine pitch. "Wait," she choked out, her hardened cynicism fracturing under raw panic. "You're putting that inside me?" It wasn't a wedding night. It was survival. The stagecoach didn't stop so much as it surrendered to the mud. Aurelia stepped down, her boots sinking 2 inches into the freezing, rust-colored slop of the way station. She didn't stumble. She rarely did. At 6 feet and 2 inches tall, Aurelia carried herself with the heavy, deliberate balance of a draft horse. She was 22, entirely too broad in the shoulders, and wore a wool coat that smelled distinctly of damp sheep and mothballs. "Trunks down!" Hiram Cobb rasped. The stage agent spat a stream of black tobacco juice into the mud, missing her hem by an inch. He didn't look her in the eye. Men rarely did. They usually looked at her chest, realized how far up her face was, and then stared at the dirt, intimidated and annoyed by the geography of her. "Thank you, Mr. Cobb," Aurelia said. Her voice was a low, flat alto. No tremble, no maidenly hesitation. She had spent her last $8 on this one-way ticket to the Colorado Territory. There was no room left for hesitation. Cobb grunted, climbed back onto the driver's bench, and snapped the reins. The coach lurched forward, its wheels fighting the earth, leaving Aurelia standing beside a battered leather trunk in a valley that looked like the bottom of a teacup. The sky above was the color of a bruised knee, purplish-gray and threatening to burst. She waited. The cold gnawed through her wool coat, biting into her ribs. She didn't wrap her arms around herself. She just stood, watching the tree line. She was a mail-order bride, a transaction brokered through 2 letters and a badly printed photograph that deliberately obscured her height. She expected a lonely, desperate man, a farmer missing a wife, or a miner needing a cook. What she didn't expect was the sheer, suffocating silence of the mountains. 20 minutes later, the timber snapped. A man rode out of the pines on a mule that looked as mean as a cornered badger. He was leading a second mule, barebacked. The man didn't ride with the straight-backed pride of a cavalryman. He slouched against the cold, letting the animal do the work. He pulled the mule to a halt 10 feet from her. Aurelia stared. He wasn't a giant. If anything, when he slid off the saddle, she realized, with a familiar, dull sink of her stomach, that she was an inch taller than him. He was built like a keg of nails, thick, immovable, wrapped in heavily patched canvas and a buffalo hide coat that had seen better decades. His beard was a dense thicket of black and grey, hiding his jaw entirely. He smelled powerfully of wood smoke, wet leather, and something metallic, like old copper. He didn't take off his hat. He just looked at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, flanked by deep, sun-baked crinkles. They tracked over her face, dropped to her shoulders, and finally settled on her muddy boots. "You're big," he said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding in a riverbed. "I am aware," Aurelia replied, her tone matching the frost in the air. "I assume you are Julian." "Julie." He walked past her, his boots making heavy sucking sounds in the mud. He reached down, grabbed the leather handle of a trunk she had struggled to drag across the Boston train platform, and hoisted it onto his shoulder with a grunt. He didn't sway. The muscles in his neck just bunched like coiled ropes. He lashed the trunk to the second mule, using rough hemp rope. He worked fast, his hands bare despite the freezing wind. Aurelia noticed the tip of his left index finger was missing. "Didn't mention you were a giant in the letter," Julie said, pulling a knot tight. He didn't look back at her. The observation wasn't an insult, it was an inventory. "You didn't mention you smelled like a tannery." Aurelia shot back, the defensive reflex kicking in. She was used to being the punchline. She was ready for the fight. Julie stopped. He turned slowly, wiping his hands on his canvas trousers. He looked up at her, those pale eyes unblinking. For a second, Aurelia thought he was going to leave her there. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched beneath the chaotic beard. Fair point. He gestured to the mule he'd been riding. Get on. Weather's turning. We got a 3-hour climb before the sleet hits. I am riding your mule, unless you can walk faster than him up a 30-degree grade in the mud. Julie grabbed the reins of the pack mule. Step on a rock, swing your leg over. No side saddles out here, lady. Hope you wore bloomers. Aurelia swallowed the tight lump of pride in her throat. She hiked up her heavy wool skirts, revealing thick cotton stockings and scuffed boots, and threw her leg over the mule's broad back. The leather saddle was freezing. Julie clicked his tongue, and the animals began to move. He walked ahead, leading the animals on foot. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't welcome her to her new life. He just started climbing. Aurelia gripped the saddle horn, her knuckles turning white, and let the mountain swallow her whole. The sky didn't rain. It spat. Tiny, sharp needles of ice mixed with freezing rain began to fall an hour into the climb, stinging Aurelia's exposed cheeks like buckshot. The trail had vanished. They were navigating a steep, rocky incline woven through dense, ancient pines. The wind didn't howl. It scraped through the branches, a low, metallic hiss. Aurelia's thighs burned. The mule beneath her was a swaying, shifting barrel, and keeping her balance required every ounce of core strength she possessed. Her coat was soaked through, the wool heavy and smelling of wet dog. She stared at Julie's back. He hadn't stopped once. He set a brutal, metronomic pace, his boots finding traction on wet stone and slick pine needles where there shouldn't have been any. He didn't speak. The silence was heavier than the freezing rain. Back east, silence was a punishment. Here, it was just the default state of the world. Hold up, Julie muttered, his voice barely carrying over the wind. He stopped abruptly. Aurelia's mule bumped into his shoulder before halting. A massive lodgepole pine had come down across the makeshift path, uprooted by a recent storm. Its root system was a towering wall of torn earth and jagged wood, blocking the narrow pass. The drop-off to their right was sheer, a terrifying plunge into a canyon of grey fog. The rock wall to their left was vertical. "We going back?" Aurelia asked, her teeth starting to chatter. "No." Julie walked to the trunk of the fallen tree. Trail's too narrow to turn the mules. Gotta move it enough to squeeze 'em under the roots. Move it. It must weigh a ton. Then you better get down and help. He wasn't joking. He didn't care that she was a woman. She was a body, a pair of hands. Aurelia slid off the mule, her legs screaming in protest as her boots hit the slick rock. She staggered, catching herself on the saddle. "Grab that branch," Julie ordered, pointing to a thick, dead limb protruding from the trunk. "When I say pull, lean back. Don't lift. Just use your weight." Aurelia waded into the mud and grabbed the rough, wet bark. The wood was freezing, tearing at her palms. She planted her boots. "Pull," Julie grunted, wedging his shoulder under the main trunk. Aurelia threw her weight backward. The tree groaned. The roots shifted, dirt cascading down the rocks. Again. "Harder," Julie ordered, his face red with exertion, his boots sliding slightly in the muck. Aurelia hauled backward, pulling with the desperate strength of a woman who wanted a fire and a dry roof more than life itself. The log shifted violently, sliding a foot down the incline. But as the tree moved, the dead limb Aurelia was holding snapped under the immense torque. She fell backward. The world tilted. She hit the slick, muddy stone hard, the breath blasting from her lungs. But the dull thud of her fall was completely eclipsed by the sickening, tearing sound that accompanied it. "Gah!" A sound ripped from her throat, not a scream, but a guttural bark of absolute shock. She looked down. The broken, jagged end of the thick pine branch, the size of a broom handle and as sharp as a spear, had whipped around as the tree rolled. It had driven straight through her heavy wool skirt, through her petticoats, and deep into the meaty part of her outer right thigh. It didn't bleed immediately, it just sat there, a thick, violently wrong protrusion of wood embedded in her flesh. Julie was there in 2 strides. He dropped to his knees, splashing muddy water across her face. He didn't ask if she was okay. He looked at the branch. "Don't move," he said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. He pulled a heavy hunting knife from his belt. It's in my leg," Aurelia stammered, the adrenaline hitting her system like a physical blow. Her vision narrowed, edges blurring with static. The pain hadn't truly bloomed yet. It was just a massive, cold pressure. "I see it." Julie grabbed the fabric of her skirt and sliced upward, ruining the garment. The cold air hit her bare skin. He gripped the base of the branch, right where it met her skin. "I gotta pull the main piece out now, or you won't be able to sit on the mule. It's gonna hurt." "Wait, you—" He didn't wait. He didn't count to 3. He just yanked. A white-hot spike of agony shattered Aurelia's vision. She screamed, a ragged, ugly sound that tore her throat. The sound echoed off the canyon walls. Blood immediately surged from the hole, thick and dark red, spilling rapidly down her pale skin and mixing with the mud beneath her. Julie shoved his bare, dirt-crusted hand directly onto the wound, pressing down with brutal force. "Breathe," he commanded. "Deep breaths." Aurelia gasped, her nails digging blindly into the muddy rock, her whole massive frame convulsing against the pain. "You animal!" She hissed through clenched teeth, tears of sheer reflex spilling hot over her freezing cheeks. "Yep," Julie agreed flatly. He reached into his coat with his free hand, pulling out a relatively clean, grey cotton handkerchief. He shoved it directly into the bleeding puncture, making Aurelia cry out again. He then took the rope he'd used for the trunk, cut a length with his knife, and tied it tightly around her thigh, over the cloth. "It's deep," Julie muttered, his hands slick with her blood. "Wood splintered in there. We need to get to the cabin." He didn't offer her a hand up. He grabbed her by the belt of her coat and practically hauled her upright. The pain shot through her leg like a lightning strike, buckling her knee. Julie caught her, throwing her arm over his broad shoulder. He smelled strongly of sweat and the iron tang of her own blood. "Can't walk," she gasped. "Don't have to." He basically carried her to the mule, lifting her by the waist and dropping her onto the saddle. The next hour was a blur of grey agony. Aurelia clung to the saddle horn, her head swimming, nausea rolling through her gut with every step the mule took. The sleet turned to snow, heavy wet flakes that settled on her eyelashes and shoulders. The cold was a blessing. It began to numb the burning in her leg, replacing it with a deep, heavy throbbing. She watched Julie trudging ahead. He never looked back. He just pulled the mule forward, a relentless, silent engine of survival. The cabin didn't look like a home. It looked like a growth on the side of the mountain. It was built of massive, unpeeled logs, tucked into a sheer rock overhang that protected it from the worst of the wind. Julie kicked the heavy plank door open and dragged Aurelia inside. It was pitch black and freezing. He dumped her unceremoniously onto a narrow rope bed in the corner. The mattress was stuffed with dried grass and crunched under her weight. "Don't pass out," Julie ordered, his voice echoing in the small space. Aurelia lay back, her teeth grinding together. Her leg felt like it was on fire, a stark contrast to the rest of her body, which was shivering uncontrollably. She heard the strike of a match. A kerosene lantern flared to life, casting long, jumping shadows across the room. The cabin was a single room. A heavy cast-iron stove dominated the center. Bundles of dried herbs, traps, and stiff, cured animal hides hung from the rafters. It smelled intensely of ash, dried meat, and masculine isolation. Julie moved with practiced efficiency. He shoved kindling into the stove, doused it with a splash of something pungent from a jug, and tossed a match in. A fire roared instantly. He threw a heavy iron kettle on top. Then he came to her. He didn't speak. He just knelt beside the bed and untied the bloody rope around her thigh. The handkerchief was soaked through, black in the lantern light. When he peeled it away, Aurelia sucked in a harsh breath. The wound was ugly, a jagged, thumb-sized puncture, ringed with angry purple bruising. It stopped bleeding heavily, Julie noted, wiping his blood-stained hands on his pants. But it's dirty. Bark and mud in there. Clean it, then, Aurelia said, her voice tight, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity while lying half undressed on a stranger's bed. I am. Julie stood up. He walked to a rough-hewn shelf and pulled down a small wooden box, a glass bottle of amber liquid, and a jar filled with thick, black sludge. He brought them to a small table near the bed. He poured the amber liquid, whiskey by the smell of it, over his hunting knife, then over his own hands. He didn't offer her a drink. Hold on to the bed frame, Julie said. Before she could ask why, he knelt, poured a splash of the raw whiskey directly into the open wound, and immediately shoved 2 thick fingers into the puncture. Aurelia didn't scream this time. She arched off the bed, a strangled, wet gasp tearing from her lips. Her vision went entirely white. Her hands clamped onto the wooden bed frame with enough force to crack the dry wood. Julie ignored her reaction. His fingers probed the hot, wet inside of her leg. Got splinters, he muttered. Big ones. Using the tip of his knife and his thumb, he pinched and dragged out a 2-inch shard of wet pine. He tossed it onto the floor. He went back in. Aurelia squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing openly now. It wasn't just the pain. It was the utter violation of it, the horrifying intimacy of this massive, dirty man digging inside her flesh. She hated him for not apologizing. She hated him for not trying to comfort her. But a tiny, cynical part of her knew that apologies wouldn't stop infection. Got the last of it, Julie said, his voice completely level. Aurelia slumped back, panting, sweat mixing with the melting snow on her forehead. Are you done? She whispered, her throat raw. No. Julie turned to the table. He took a piece of clean, boiled linen from the box. He dipped it into the jar of black sludge. The smell hit Aurelia instantly, a caustic, eye-watering stench of rendered animal fat, sharp pine tar, and something bitter like yarrow. He took the heavy iron poker from the stove, which was glowing dull orange at the tip, and touched it to the sludge-covered rag. The rag hissed, smoking violently, heating the tar until it practically boiled. He turned back to her, holding the steaming, foul-smelling poultice and the bone-handled knife. He intended to use the knife blade to guide the rag deep into the puncture. Aurelia pressed her spine against the rough-hewn log wall, her 6'2" frame trembling for the first time since she left Boston. The mountain man didn't blink. Wait, she choked out, her hardened cynicism fracturing under raw panic. You're putting that inside me? Got to, Julie said, his pale eyes fixing on hers. Wound's deep. You close it up now. It heals on the outside, rots on the inside. Leg turns black. You die of blood poison in a week. Got to pack it with hot pitch. Keeps it open, draws the poison out, heals from the inside up. He didn't flinch away from the ugliness of the truth. He didn't sugarcoat it. It will burn, Aurelia stated, staring at the smoking black rag. Like hell, Julie agreed. He didn't tell her to be brave. He didn't tell her it would be over soon. He just waited for her to accept it. Aurelia looked at this man, her husband-to-be. He was covered in mud and her blood. He was rough, uncultured, and terrifyingly practical. Back east, a doctor would have given her laudanum, patted her hand, and probably let her die of gangrene in a clean, white bed. She swallowed hard, tasting bile and fear. She uncurled her fingers from the bed frame and grabbed fistfuls of the straw mattress instead. She locked her eyes onto the rough timber of the ceiling. Do it! She hissed. Julie didn't hesitate. He drove the steaming, tar-soaked linen deep into the muscle of her thigh. The heat was absolute. It was a searing, consuming fire that ate through her nervous system. Aurelia's jaw locked. She let out a long, high, keening sound, her massive body thrashing against the ropes of the bed. Julie threw his heavy forearm across her chest, pinning her down with shocking, immovable strength, while his other hand packed the burning pitch tightly into the wound. "Breathe, Abby," he growled, using her shortened name for the first time. It wasn't an endearment, it was an anchor. "Breathe!" She fought him, her hands flying up to claw at his arms, her nails scraping against his thick canvas sleeves. He didn't yield an inch. He just absorbed her panic, holding her down until the initial, mind-shattering shock of the burn began to dull into a steady, vicious throb. Slowly her thrashing stopped. She lay limp, gasping for air, her chest heaving against his heavy forearm. She was drenched in sweat, her hair plastered to her skull. Julie slowly lifted his arm away. He wrapped a clean bandage tightly around her thigh to hold the packing in place. "It's done," he said quietly. He didn't walk away immediately. He pulled a heavy wool blanket from a chest and threw it over her, covering her shivering, half-exposed body. Then, he poured 2 fingers of the whiskey into a tin cup and held it to her lips. "Drink?" Aurelia didn't argue. She let him tip the tin cup, the cheap alcohol burning a new, welcome path down her throat. She coughed, turning her head away. Julie set the cup down. He pulled up a 3-legged stool and sat beside the bed, his knees almost touching hers. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper in the lantern light. "You're tougher than you look," Julie said. "And you look pretty tough." Aurelia let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It was a bleak, cynical noise in the quiet cabin. "I'm a mail-order bride, Julie. I expected a man desperate for conversation, maybe a little lonely. I didn't expect amateur surgery." "Mountains don't care what you expect," Julie replied, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I needed a wife who wouldn't snap in half the first time the wind blew. Cobb said you were too big to marry off in the city. Said you were a burden to your folks." Aurelia turned her head, looking at him fully. The bluntness of his words stung, but there was no malice in them, just facts. "And you wanted a burden?" "I wanted a partner," Julie corrected, his voice low, the gravel rougher now. "Someone who can stand the cold. Someone who can help me drag a deadfall off a trail." He looked at her heavily bandaged leg. "You helped." Aurelia stared at him. The smell of the burning pine pitch filled the room, pungent and strangely clean. Her leg throbbed with a slow, heavy heartbeat, but beneath the pain there was a strange, terrifying grounding. She wasn't a spectacle here. She wasn't an oversized spinster to be pitied or mocked. She was just a woman who had survived the climb. "If I survive this leg," Aurelia whispered, her eyelids growing incredibly heavy as the exhaustion and whiskey hit her bloodstream. "You're buying me a new coat." Julian reached out. His thick, calloused thumb brushed a clump of wet hair off her forehead. It was the first gentle thing he had done all day. "Deal," he said. The fever didn't wash over her like a tide. It collapsed on her like a cave-in. Sometime during the second night, the chill in the cabin vanished, replaced by a suffocating, arid heat that radiated from Aurelia's own bones. The pitch inside her thigh stopped feeling like a foreign object and became a living ember, pulsing in time with her frantic heartbeat. Time lost its architecture. The boundaries between the rough log walls and the dark corners of her own mind blurred into a hot, confusing smear. She was back in Boston. She was standing in the cramped parlor of Mrs. Gable's boarding house, trying to shrink her shoulders so she wouldn't block the narrow hallway. The other girls, petite, bird-boned creatures who smelled of rose water and desperation, were laughing behind their hands. Look at the draft horse. they whispered, their voices like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Who would buy a draft horse when they could have a pony? I can pull a plough, Aurelia mumbled to the dark ceiling of the cabin, her tongue thick and tasting of old pennies. I can pull it out of the mud. You don't have to pull anything right now. The voice was gravel and wood smoke. It didn't belong in the parlor. A calloused hand, smelling strongly of lye, soap, and leather, slid behind her neck. It was a massive hand, the only hand she had ever felt that made her own feel proportional. It lifted her heavy head from the straw mattress. The movement sent a jarring, sickening spike of pain down her leg, making her gag. Drink. The rim of a tin cup pressed against her cracked lower lip. Aurelia swallowed blindly. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of iron, but it was salvation. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin and soaking into the collar of the rough flannel shirt someone, Julie, she realized dimly, had swapped her ruined bodice for. She opened her eyes. Her vision swam, struggling to focus in the dim orange glow of the banked stove. Julie was leaning over her. He had taken off his heavy buffalo coat. He wore a faded thermal undershirt that clung to a chest and shoulders built like a granite outcropping. Sweat plastered his dark, unruly hair to his forehead. "You're burning up," he stated. It wasn't a sympathetic observation. It was a weather report. "Leg?" she gasped, her hands bunching the coarse wool blanket. "Take it out, it's burning. The pitch stays." He lowered her head back down onto the mattress. "It's doing what it's supposed to do, drawing the rot out. Your body is just fighting the dirt that got left behind. It's boiling my blood." She squeezed her eyes shut. The cynicism she wielded like a shield in the waking world melted under the heat of the fever. She felt terribly, pathetically small, a cruel irony given her frame. She hated him for seeing her like this. She hated him for being the one keeping her alive. "Just let me sleep." "You can sleep, but you don't get to die." Julie pulled a bucket closer to the bed. He wrung out a rag in the cold mountain water. He didn't dab her forehead with the delicate touch of a nurse. He wiped her face with the firm, thorough efficiency of a man cleaning a rifle barrel. He wiped the sour sweat from her brow, down her cheeks, and over her neck. The cold shock of the water made her gasp, her spine arching off the bed. "Stop," she groaned, trying to push his arm away. Her hand met his forearm. It felt like grabbing a fence post. She lacked the strength to move him an inch. Julie didn't stop. He re-wet the rag and wiped down her arms. "You gotta stay cool, Abby. Fever breaks the brain if it gets too high. Seen a man forget his own name from a tick bite. Maybe I want to forget mine." She slurred, the delirium pulling her back under. "Too bad. I paid good money for a Phillips. I aim to keep her." It was a transaction. He reminded her of the transaction. Strangely, the blunt, unromantic truth of it grounded her. He wasn't saving a damsel. He was protecting an investment. It was a terrible, beautiful honesty that didn't demand she be grateful or pretty. It just demanded she survive. For 3 days, the cabin shrank to the size of that bed. Aurelia fluctuated between agonizing lucidity, where the pain in her thigh made her chew the inside of her cheek until it bled, and terrifying hallucinations. She dreamt of the stagecoach agent, his mouth a black cavern, spitting chewing tobacco that turned into beetles. She dreamt of the fallen pine tree rolling over her, crushing her ribs, burying her in the freezing mud. Through it all, the mountain man was a constant, solid mass in her peripheral vision. He forced broth down her throat, a greasy, salty liquid made from dried venison that tasted like survival. He held her down when the chills racked her massive frame so violently she nearly threw herself off the ropes. And in the moments she would never speak of, once she was whole again, he changed the bandages. He did it with a clinical, detached focus. He never lingered. He never looked at the exposed expanse of her pale thigh with anything other than grim assessment. He would peel back the crusted linen, the stench of suppuration and sharp pine tar filling the small room, inspect the angry red perimeter of the puncture, and pack fresh, clean wool around the protruding tar plug. He saw her stripped of all dignity, covered in sweat, smelling of sickness, crying out in ugly, guttural sobs when the pain peaked. He witnessed the complete dismantling of her stoicism. And yet, when she opened her eyes in the quiet hours of the night, he was always there, sitting on the three-legged stool, whittling a piece of kindling or staring into the belly of the stove. He didn't look disgusted. He didn't look burdened. He just looked waiting. The first thing Aurelia noticed was the silence, the roaring in her ears, the phantom sound of her own rushing, fevered blood, had stopped. The cabin was utterly still, save for the subtle, rhythmic snick-snick of a whetstone dragging across steel. She opened her eyes. The light in the cabin was different. It wasn't the manic, jumping orange of the kerosene lantern. It was a pale, flat grey, filtering through the single, thick-paned window near the door. Morning light. Real light. She took a breath. Her chest didn't rattle. Her skin felt cool, clammy, and uncomfortably tight, layered with days of dried sweat. She swallowed, finding her throat raw but functioning. She shifted her weight. Ah! A sharp, localized hiss escaped her teeth. The pain was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer a consuming fire. It was a heavy, dull ache, isolated entirely to the right quadrant of her thigh. The leg felt stiff, heavy as lead, but it felt like her leg again, not a rotting appendage. The scraping of the whetstone stopped. Julie turned around from the small workbench in the corner. He set down the hatchet he'd been sharpening. He looked worse than she felt. His beard was wilder, the dark circles under his pale blue eyes looking like bruises carved into his weather-beaten face. His canvas shirt was stained with soot, grease, and dried soup. He stood up, walking over to the bed. He didn't ask how she felt. He simply looked at her eyes, noting the clarity that hadn't been there for 72 hours. "Fever's broke," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Water," Aurelia croaked. Julie picked up the tin dipper from the bucket, bypassing the cup entirely, and held it to her mouth. She drank a full pint, the cold, clean water shocking her system awake. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her trembling hand. "How long?" she asked. 4 days, Julie replied, setting the dipper down. "Missed your own wedding." Aurelia let out a short, dry scoff. "I doubt the Reverend was waiting in the snow. Nearest preacher is 3 days' ride in a good summer," Julie said, pulling the blanket back slightly to inspect her leg. "Was just going to be me, you, and a Bible I got in the trunk." He unwrapped the outer bandage. The smell hit the air, stale sweat and the sharp tang of the pitch. He peered at the wound. The angry purple bruising had faded to a sickly yellow. The skin wasn't hot to the touch. "Looks ugly as sin," Julie muttered, "but it ain't rotting. The pitch held. You'll keep the leg." "Ah, thank you," she said. The words tasted foreign. She was a woman who prided herself on needing no one, on paying her own way through sheer physical labor and stubbornness. Acknowledging this debt felt like swallowing a stone. Julie met her eyes for a brief second, then looked away, retying the bandage. "Don't thank me yet. You've still got to walk on it eventually." He stood up. "I'll make some oats. You need food that ain't liquid." He turned toward the stove. Aurelia lay there, assessing the reality of her situation. Her fever was gone, which meant her mind was clear. And with clarity came the crushing weight of biological necessity. She hadn't left this bed in 4 days. Her bladder was screaming in agony. A hot flush of deep, profound humiliation crept up her neck, coloring her pale cheeks. She was 22 years old. She was a giant, and she couldn't walk to the outhouse. During the fever, she had vague, horrifying memories of him shifting her, of cold air and warm water, but the lucidity of the present made the reality unbearable. She stared at his broad back as he stirred a cast-iron pot on the stove. "Julian," she said. Her voice was tight, strained. He didn't turn around. "Yeah?" "I require." She stopped. She swallowed hard, staring at a knot in the log wall. "I need to relieve myself, and I cannot stand." The stirring stopped. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the bubbling of the water in the pot. The silence stretched, thick and humiliating. Julie set the wooden spoon down. He didn't look at her. He walked to the corner of the room, behind a stack of cured hides, and pulled out a battered enamel chamber pot. He carried it to the side of the bed. He set it down on the floor. Then, without a single word, without a glance at her face, he walked to the heavy plank door, lifted the iron latch, and stepped out into the freezing mountain morning, pulling the door shut behind him with a solid click. Aurelia stared at the closed door. He hadn't made a joke. He hadn't sighed in annoyance. He hadn't lingered to make it awkward. He had simply given her the tool and the privacy to preserve whatever shred of dignity she had left. With a ragged breath, she gripped the edge of the mattress. Dragging her dead, throbbing leg behind her, she forced her massive frame to the edge of the bed. The pain flared, sharp and warning, but she gritted her teeth, tears of sheer physical exertion pricking her eyes. 10 minutes later, the door latch clicked open. Aurelia was back under the blankets, panting softly, her forehead damp with fresh sweat from the effort. The chamber pot was pushed safely under the bed. Julie walked back in. A blast of frigid air followed him, smelling of pine and ozone. He didn't look towards the floor. He walked straight to the stove, picked up the wooden spoon, and resumed stirring. "Snow's deep," he said casually, his tone completely neutral. "Gonna take a day of digging just to get to the woodpile proper." Aurelia watched his back. Her chest felt strangely tight, and it had nothing to do with the fever. It was a foreign, uncomfortable feeling of profound respect. "I can dig," she said quietly. "When the leg heals." Julie scooped a thick, greyish mass of oats into a tin bowl. He tossed a handful of shriveled dried apples on top and poured a splash of canned milk over it. He brought it to the bed, handing her the bowl and a heavy iron spoon. "I know you can," Julie said, pulling up his stool. "That's why I bought your ticket." He sat down with his own bowl. They didn't speak another word. They just ate in the grey morning light, the only sound the scraping of iron spoons against tin, two massive, solitary people sharing a silence that, for the first time, didn't feel entirely empty. The worst part of surviving was the itching. 3 weeks into her confinement, the jagged crater in Aurelia's thigh began to knit itself together. The foul-smelling tar plug had eventually worked its way out, leaving behind a puckered, angry ring of fresh pink skin that stretched tight over the muscle. It itched with a maddening, deep-tissue persistence that made her want to take Julie's hunting knife and flay herself. Instead, she dragged a wooden comb through the raw wool of a mended sock, her jaw clamped shut. The cabin had shrunk. With the snow banking 4 feet high against the north-facing wall, the single room felt less like a shelter and more like a submarine trapped beneath a frozen sea. The air was thick, heavy with the permanent scent of wood ash, rendering tallow, and the metallic tang of drying animal skins. Aurelia sat on a 3-legged stool near the stove, her bad leg propped straight out on a sawn-off log. Julie had fashioned her a crude crutch from a Y-shaped birch branch, but navigating the tight quarters with it usually resulted in her knocking over a bucket or catching her broad shoulders on the hanging pelts. So she sat. And she worked. She took over the mending. She scrubbed the cast-iron skillets with salt and snowmelt until her knuckles bled. She chopped root vegetables with a rhythmic, aggressive force, the heavy knife thudding into the butcher block like an executioner's axe. She refused to be dead weight. In Boston, her size had made her an anomaly, a grotesque punchline. Here, it was an engine she was desperate to restart. The door latch clattered, breaking the heavy silence. Julie pushed his way inside, bringing a swirl of violent, biting wind with him. He kicked the door shut with the heel of his boot and dropped a burlap sack onto the floorboards with a wet, heavy thud. He looked entirely encased in winter. Frost clumped in his chaotic beard, and his buffalo coat was stiff with frozen sleet. He didn't greet her. He rarely did. He just walked to the stove, peeled off his rigid leather gloves, and held his red, chapped hands over the iron grate. Aurelia didn't look up from the sock she was darning. "Coffee is hot, left side of the grate. Stew is on the right." Julie grunted. He grabbed a rag, wrapped it around the handle of the battered tin percolator, and poured a cup of coffee so dark it looked like crude oil. He drank it black, scalding hot, his throat working in heavy swallows. Only then did he exhale, a long, ragged sound that seemed to carry the weight of the entire mountain. "Trap lines are freezing over," he rasped, his voice rougher than usual from the cold. "Ice is too thick on the creek. Only pulled 2 marten and a weasel." He kicked the burlap sack. A dark, frozen stain seeped through the rough fabric onto the floor. "I can skin them," Aurelia offered. Julie paused, his tin cup halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, his pale blue eyes tracking over her stiff posture, her massive frame hunched over the tiny needle and thread. "You ever skinned a marten, Boston?" "No," she replied flatly. "But I imagine it involves a knife, a dead animal, and separating the two. I can follow instructions." A muscle feathered along his jawline. It wasn't a smile, but it was a loosening of the permanent tension he carried. "Pelt's delicate. You tear it. It ain't worth the powder to blow it to hell." "Then I won't tear it." She set the darning aside and grabbed her birch crutch. She leveraged herself up, her bad leg throbbing a dull, rhythmic warning. She hobbled over to the heavy timber table, sweeping aside a pile of dried beans with her forearm. "Bring it here." Julie watched her for a long moment. He didn't argue. He picked up the frozen sack, dumped the stiff, bloody carcasses onto the table, and pulled a small, wicked-looking skinning knife from his belt. For the next 2 hours, the cabin was filled with the sickening, wet sounds of tearing fascia and snapping cartilage. Julie stood shoulder to shoulder with her. He smelled of pine needles, dried sweat, and freezing wind. He showed her where to make the initial cuts down the hind legs, how to peel the skin back like a wet glove, using her thumbs to separate the membrane without nicking the fur. Aurelia's hands were large, but they were steady. She didn't flinch at the blood that coated her fingers, turning tacky in the warmth of the stove. She didn't gag at the smell of raw, frozen muscle and the sharp musk of the animal. She focused entirely on the blade, on the resistance of the hide, leaning her considerable weight against the table to spare her healing leg. "Easy around the ears," Julie murmured, his deep voice vibrating right next to her ear. He reached over, his large, scarred hand covering hers to guide the blade angle. His grip was startlingly hot against her blood-chilled skin. The contact was purely instructional, a pragmatic adjustment of leverage, yet Aurelia felt a strange, involuntary hitch in her chest. It was the first time he had touched her without a medical necessity. His thumb brushed against her knuckles, rough, calloused, missing its tip. And she felt a sudden, terrifying awareness of her own isolation with this man. She pulled her hand back slightly, adjusting her grip on the knife handle. "I have it." Julie withdrew his hand immediately, stepping back half a pace. "You do." He watched her finish the pelt, pulling it clean over the skull. She handed the bloody skin to him. He inspected it, turning it over in the lantern light. There were no tears. The fur was unmarred. "Not bad," he said, high praise from a man who used words like rations. He took the pelt to a stretching board in the corner, leaving Aurelia with the wet, skinned carcass. She grabbed a rag and began wiping the gore from her hands. She looked down at the ruined meat, then up at the broad, immovable line of Julie's back. She had paid $8 for a train ticket to escape a life where she was a useless spectacle. Here, covered in animal blood and smelling of wood smoke, standing on one good leg, she felt horrifyingly, wonderfully useful. The blizzard hit 3 days later. It didn't arrive with a dramatic howl. It descended like a suffocating grey blanket, erasing the trees, the canyon, and the sky. The wind battered the heavy log walls with the concussive force of a runaway train, rattling the cast-iron stovepipe and forcing freezing drafts through the chinking. They were trapped. Even Julie couldn't push the heavy door open against the drifted snow. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was cast in a gloomy, unnatural twilight. Julie had lit 2 kerosene lanterns, setting them on the table. He hadn't spoken in hours. He had been sitting on the floor by his battered trunk, sorting through a pile of rusty traps, his jaw set in a grim, rigid line. Aurelia sat on the edge of the bed, her leg extended. The boredom was beginning to feel aggressive. Suddenly, Julie stood up. He walked to the trunk, bypassed the traps, and dug deep into the bottom, pulling out a heavy, rectangular object wrapped in oiled canvas. He carried it to the table, unwrapped it, and set it down in the yellow pool of lantern light. It was a Bible. Its leather cover was cracked, peeling at the corners, the pages yellowed and warped by decades of dampness. Julie wiped his hands on his canvas trousers. He looked across the small room at Aurelia. "Legs healed enough to stand," he said. It wasn't a question. Aurelia stared at the book. Her stomach dropped, a sudden cold weight settling in her pelvis. She knew what this meant. The transaction was coming due. The survival phase was over. The reality of the arrangement was here. "It is," she said quietly. "Storm's going to blow for 2 days." Julie continued, his tone flat, entirely devoid of ceremony or sentiment. "Might as well get it done. We made a deal." A deal. Not a promise. Not a union. A deal. A sharp, jagged spike of resentment flared in Aurelia's chest. She had agreed to this. She had wanted pragmatism. She had scoffed at the soft, romantic notions of the girls back in Boston, knowing her massive frame and sharp tongue disqualified her from sonnets and bouquets. But staring at the battered book and the dirt-crusted mountain man, a pathetic, deeply buried part of her mourned the absence of a simple, gentle word. She swallowed the bitterness. It tasted like ash. "All right," Aurelia said. She grabbed her crutch and pushed herself up. She didn't have a dress. She was wearing a pair of Julie's old suspended trousers, rolled up at the cuffs, over her thick wool stockings, and a faded flannel shirt that belonged to a dead trapper Julie had known. Her hair, which she usually kept braided and pinned flat, was loose, falling in a heavy, unruly, dark wave down her back because her hairpins had been lost in the mud. She hobbled to the table and stood opposite him. She was an inch taller, her shoulders just as broad beneath the flannel. They didn't look like a bride and groom. They looked like 2 weary labourers squaring off over a property line. Julie opened the Bible. The spine cracked sharply in the quiet room. He flipped through the pages, his thick fingers clumsy against the thin paper. He didn't look for the Song of Solomon or Corinthians. He just flipped until he found a page that wasn't water-damaged. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He stared at the page. "I, Julian Boone, take you." "Aurelia." He paused, clearing the gravel from his throat. "Take you to be my wife, to provide for, to protect from the cold and the wolves, till the ground takes one of us." It wasn't scripture. It was a contract of survival. He looked up then. His pale eyes met hers across the flickering lantern light. The wind shrieked against the logs outside, a terrifying reminder of exactly what he was offering to protect her from. Aurelia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Her throat was incredibly tight. She couldn't remember the traditional vows, and even if she could, they felt absurd in this brutal, smelling box of a room. I, Aurelia Phillips. She started, her alto voice shaking just a fraction before she locked it down tight. Take you, Julian, to keep your fire, to work your furs, to stand my ground, until the mountain takes us. Silence stretched between them, heavier than the snow outside. There was no ring. Julie didn't reach into his pocket. He just reached his right hand across the table. His hand was immense, the skin scarred, rough as sandpaper, the missing fingertip a stark reminder of the violence of his world. Aurelia looked at his hand. This wasn't a gentleman offering an arm. This was a man sealing a bargain. She reached out and gripped his hand. The moment their palms met, the sheer physical reality of him grounded her rushing thoughts. His grip was firm, calloused, radiating an intense, raw heat. It was a handshake, utterly devoid of romance, yet it felt more binding, more terrifyingly permanent than any gilded ring could have been. They stood there for a long moment, their hands locked over the ancient, peeling Bible, the wind screaming murder outside the timber walls. Done, Julie said quietly. He didn't pull her into a kiss. He didn't smile. He released her hand slowly, his calloused thumb dragging briefly across her knuckles in a movement so slight it might have been accidental. Done, Aurelia echoed, her voice barely a whisper. Julie closed the Bible, wrapped it back in the oiled canvas, and returned it to the trunk. He walked back to his stool, picked up a rusty beaver trap, and began working the spring with a heavy iron file. The metallic scrape filled the room, settling back into the rhythm of survival. Aurelia stood by the table, her hand tingling from his grip. She was a married woman. She looked at the man filing the trap, his broad shoulders hunched, completely absorbed in the work. He hadn't promised her love. He hadn't promised her happiness. He had promised her survival. She turned, grabbing her crutch, and hobbled back towards the stove to check the stew. As the bitter wind slammed against the cabin, Aurelia realized with a strange, cynical comfort that out here, survival was the only vow that mattered. The aftermath of a wedding usually involved music, a feast, and the quiet closing of a bedroom door. The aftermath of Aurelia and Julian's wedding involved a drop in barometric pressure that made the cabin's log joints crack like rifle fire. By midnight, the temperature had plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. The iron stove, stuffed to the brim with dense oak, glowed a dangerous cherry red, yet it couldn't push the heat past a 5-foot radius. Beyond that circle, the air was a physical, biting entity that frosted the inside of the window panes with thick, opaque ice. Aurelia lay rigid under 3 heavy wool blankets on the rope bed. Her healing leg throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a phantom complaint against the dropping mercury. She was fully clothed, wearing her heavy flannel shirt and the thick wool socks she had spent the afternoon darning. Still, she shivered. The cold was seeping up through the straw mattress, stealing the heat right out of her spine. She turned her head. Julie was on the floor. He had laid out a thick canvas tarp, a buffalo hide, and 2 thin grey blankets near the door, giving her the space nearest the stove. He was a massive shadow in the gloom, curled onto his side, his back to the room. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched metallic squeal that tore at the roof shingles. In the brief silence that followed, Aurelia heard a sound that made her stomach tighten. It was a rapid, involuntary clicking. Teeth! Julie was shivering violently, his massive frame vibrating against the frozen floorboards. "Julian!" she called out, her voice barely carrying over the draft. The clicking stopped instantly. The shadow went perfectly still, feigning sleep with the stubborn pride of a man used to dying quietly. "I can hear you," Aurelia said, her tone flat, refusing to let him hide behind his stoicism. A heavy sigh ruffled the canvas. "Go to sleep, Abby. Floor's just drafty." "The floor is ice and you are freezing." "I got the hide. I'm fine." Aurelia stared at the ceiling. A year ago, back in Mrs. Gable's parlour, if a man had offered to sleep on a freezing floor for her comfort, she would have rolled her eyes at the theatrics. But this wasn't theatre. It was a grim, slow death by exposure. He was protecting his investment. He was keeping his vow. "Get up," she said. Silence. "Julian Boone, I did not survive a tree branch through my leg and 3 weeks of eating boiled oats just to wake up a widow because you are too mule-headed to share a heat source. Get off the floor." Slowly the shadow shifted. Julie sat up, the buffalo hide sliding off his broad shoulders. He didn't argue. The cold was too absolute for masculine posturing. He stood, a looming silhouette in the dying orange light of the stove, grabbed his blankets, and walked to the edge of the narrow rope bed. He hesitated. "Bed's not built for two." "Then we will sleep entirely still?" Aurelia replied. She shifted her weight, dragging her bad leg toward the rough log wall, leaving exactly half of the narrow mattress bare. "Lie down, before we both freeze." Julie lay down. The rope frame groaned ominously, the thick hemp protesting under the sudden addition of 220 pounds of muscle and bone. The mattress sagged heavily in the middle. Gravity immediately conspired against them, pulling Aurelia's back down the slope towards him. They lay shoulder to shoulder, both staring straight up at the dark rafters. They were entirely too big for the space. His upper arm was pressed firmly against hers. His hip bumped against her thigh. He was freezing. His canvas shirt felt like a sheet of ice against her flannel. But beneath the icy fabric, he was a furnace. The sheer, dense mass of him began to radiate a slow, heavy warmth. Aurelia's shivering hitched, then began to subside as the ambient temperature between them equalized. "Leg okay?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that she felt in her own chest. "It's fine. Don't kick it." "Wasn't planning on kicking anything." They fell silent. The intimacy was horrifying in its raw practicality. There was no romance in the dark, no gentle caresses or whispered promises. There was only the heavy scent of wood smoke, old leather, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies trapped indoors. They smelled like survival. They smelled real. Aurelia closed her eyes. The tension in her shoulders, a knot she had carried since the stagecoach dropped her in the mud, slowly began to unravel. She was crushed against a wall, sharing a sagging, grass-stuffed mattress with a stranger covered in animal grease. And yet, feeling the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his immense chest next to hers, feeling the brutal cold being pushed back by their shared body heat, she felt an overwhelming, cynical sense of security. She wasn't a burden taking up too much space. She was an equal weight on the ropes. Sometime deep in the night, as the storm raged on, Julie shifted. He rolled heavily onto his side, facing her back. He didn't wrap his arms around her, but he shifted closer, closing the final half-inch of space between them. His broad chest pressed against her shoulder blades, his knees tucking in behind hers, careful to avoid the healing puncture wound. He was a solid, immovable wall of heat at her back. Aurelia didn't move away. She let out a long, slow breath, letting her heavy frame sink fully into the mattress, and finally slept. The thaw came all at once, turning the mountain into a bleeding, muddy wound. The grey sky cracked open in late April, revealing a sun so bright and vicious it made Aurelia's eyes water. The 4-foot snowdrifts banked against the cabin slumped and collapsed, melting into rushing, icy streams that chewed deep ruts into the earth. The air smelled of wet pine needles, thawing rot, and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. Aurelia stood beside the woodblock, a heavy iron maul resting against her thigh. Her breathing was heavy, misting slightly in the cool morning air. She was sweating. She swung the maul. The thick iron head bit deep into the round of green oak with a satisfying, concussive thwack, splitting the wood clean down the middle. "You're favoring your left." Aurelia stopped, leaning on the long hickory handle. She looked down the trail. Julie was walking up the muddy incline, leading the two bad-tempered mules. He had been gone for 4 days, his first trip down to the way station since the blizzard. He looked exactly as he had the day she met him, a massive, slouching force of nature encased in canvas and leather, his beard chaotic, his pale eyes tracking her every movement. "I am favoring the leg that didn't have a pine tree inside of it." Aurelia shot back, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She walked toward him. She had a pronounced limp now, a heavy, dragging roll on her right side that she would carry for the rest of her life. But she didn't require the birch crutch anymore. She walked on her own. Julie halted the mules near the porch. He didn't smile. He didn't say he missed her. But his eyes lingered on her face for a second longer than necessary before he turned to unlash the cargo. "Cobb says the stage lines are running again," Julie grunted, hauling a heavy sack of flour off the pack mule's back. "Brought up coffee, salt, and enough kerosene to get through the summer." He dropped the sacks onto the porch boards. Then he reached over to his own saddle. He unbuckled a thick canvas strap and pulled down a large, bulky bundle wrapped in brown trade paper and tied with twine. He walked over to her. He held the bundle out. Aurelia looked at the package, then up at his face. "What is that?" "Open it." She set them all down. Her hands were calloused now, her nails chipped and stained with pitch, completely unrecognizable from the soft hands that had bought the train ticket in Boston. She pulled the twine loose and tore back the heavy brown paper. Inside was a coat. It wasn't a lady's riding jacket or a fashionable wool pea coat. It was a heavy, dark, olive-green canvas duster. It was lined with incredibly dense, unbleached sheepskin. It had thick brass buttons, deep pockets reinforced with leather, and a collar wide enough to block a blizzard. Aurelia stared at it. She ran her rough hand over the canvas. It was stiff, durable, and smelled powerfully of lanolin and fresh dye. "I measured you against the doorframe before I left," Julie said, his voice entirely matter-of-fact. "Sent the measurements to a tailor in Denver with Cobb a month ago. Told him to build it for a giant. Told him it had to withstand a knife. He didn't buy her a dress to make her feel pretty. He bought her armor." Aurelia felt a sudden, massive lump rise in her throat. The sheer, overwhelming pragmatism of the gesture bypassed all her cynical defenses. It was the most romantic thing she had ever seen. She handed him the torn paper and grabbed the heavy duster by the collar. She swung it around her shoulders and pushed her long arms through the sleeves. It was heavy. It sat perfectly on her broad shoulders, falling all the way down past her knees, covering the scar on her thigh entirely. She buttoned the thick brass buttons up her chest. It wasn't tight. It gave her room to swing an axe. It gave her room to breathe. "Well?" Julie asked, crossing his massive arms over his chest. Aurelia looked up at him. She didn't cry. Crying was for the parlor. She just stood there, a 6'2" woman in a muddy clearing, wearing a coat built for a lumberjack, feeling entirely, utterly seen. "It'll do," she said. Her voice was thick, a low alto that cracked slightly on the last word. Julie's mouth twitched beneath his beard. It was a microscopic movement, but to Aurelia it was as loud as a gunshot. "Deal," he said softly. He reached out. He didn't grab her waist or pull her into a cinematic embrace. He just reached out and gripped the thick canvas lapel of her new coat. He pulled her forward, closing the space between them, and pressed his forehead against hers. He smelled of horse sweat, chewing tobacco, and cold mountain wind. She smelled of oak sap, lye soap, and effort. They stood there in the mud, two massive, scarred, imperfect people, leaning their heavy heads against one another under the blinding spring sun. The transaction was over. The partnership had begun, and the mountain, for all its brutality, finally felt like home. Did you feel the freezing wind and the raw, gritty reality of Aurelia and Julian's first day together? Survival in the mountains isn't pretty, and romance here is forged in fire and grit. If you want to see how Aurelia survives the fever, what secrets Julie is hiding in that cabin, and if they can turn this brutal transaction into real love, hit that like button, share this story with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe right now. Drop a comment below. Would you have let him pack that wound?